The last ordinary morning lasted 47 minutes. She has counted it so many times the number feels worn smooth, like a coin handled past the point of legibility. 47 minutes between the moment her daughter pressed a paper envelope into her hand and the moment the sky changed color. The Thalvec Dominion had already crossed 14 star systems to reach them. 9 billion people were still alive on a planet they had never heard of. And humanity, all of it, every city and coast and argument and recipe and unfinished sentence, had no idea what was coming down through the clouds. Asha Meridh had been an engineer before she was anything else. She understood load-bearing systems. She knew precisely how much weight a frame could hold before the failure point arrived. She had spent 7 years learning that she herself was a frame and testing her own tolerances one decision at a time. She had not broken yet. She was not sure, standing on the bridge of the TRV unmarked grave with her hand pressed flat against her left breast pocket, whether that was a fact she should be proud of. The sensor panel in front of Warrant Officer Preth Callow showed a number. 9 billion. Not a ship count, not a weapons signature. A population figure pulled from Thalvec census records captured 3 months ago, now rendered relevant by an alarm tone that had been sounding for 40 seconds without anyone silencing it. The battle was won. The 900 Thalvec warships that had formed a defensive sphere around their homeworld were broken, surrendering, drifting, burning. The Dominion was finished. The 14 systems it had held for 4 centuries were contracting, one by one, like a fist slowly opening. And the sovereign absolute Creveth More, 400 years old, hauled from 3 succession challenges and a lifetime of conquest nobody had ever forced him to personally witness, had retreated to a bunker beneath his capital city and issued a final order. Preth Callow's voice was completely steady. "Commander, your orders." He had learned that from her. Asha's hand was still against her pocket. Inside, through 2 layers of fabric, she could feel the edge of a paper envelope that had been refolded so many times the creases had become permanent geography. She had not opened it, not in 7 years. She had carried it across the destruction of an empire, and she had not opened it once because opening it meant something was finished, and she had not been finished yet. She was not sure in this moment what she was. You'll want to know what she did with 40 minutes and 9 billion lives. Stay with me. The morning the sky changed color, she had been on leave for 11 days. Not by choice. Her supervisor at the Coastal Structures Institute had looked at the circles under her eyes and the way she kept rereading the same paragraph of load-stress documentation without turning the page, and he had told her to go home. She had gone home. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in their house 3 blocks from the water, watching her daughter Riva conduct a structural experiment on a piece of toast. Riva was 8, she had her father's patience and her mother's need to understand how things worked, which meant she approached every problem the way a small scientist approaches a very large question, by touching it and watching what happened and touching it again. The toast was balanced at an angle against a glass of juice. Riva was adding weight to the high end, 1 blueberry at a time, with the focused expression of someone who expected the data to mean something. "It's going to fall," Asha said. "I know," Riva said. "I want to see when." Dalton came in from the back of the house carrying 2 mugs of tea, because he made tea with unnecessary ceremony, the specific kettle, the specific timing, the argument they had every few weeks about whether it needed to sit before pouring. Asha had told him 100 times that it did not need to sit. She had been wrong and she had never admitted it. She thought about that sometimes afterward. She thought about it more than made any sense. He set a mug in front of her and watched Riva add a 7th blueberry. "We're supposed to decide about the coast trip," he said. "I know. Before the end of the month, otherwise the rental goes." "I know, don't. I'm just noting that knowing and deciding are different behaviors." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. He was smiling. He had the kind of face that smiled easily and meant it every time, which she had found slightly suspicious when they first met and had found by degrees to be the most reliable thing she had ever known. They would resolve the coast trip argument later. She was certain of it. There was no urgency. There was all the time that people assume they have until the specific morning they discover they do not. Riva added an 8th blueberry. The toast fell. She wrote something in the small notebook she kept for this kind of result, nodded once, and reached across the table to hand her mother a folded paper envelope. "What's this?" "It's for keeping," Riva said. "Marigolds are for keeping." Asha opened the flap. Inside was a single flower pressed flat, a marigold still faintly orange, dried carefully between the pages of something and transferred here. She looked at her daughter. "Why marigolds?" But Riva had already moved on to the juice glass, which she was now apparently considering as a second structural subject, and the question went unanswered. Asha folded the envelope closed and put it in the front pocket of her coat, meaning to ask again later. She did not ask again later. 47 minutes after that, the sky changed color. Not suddenly. That was the part nobody talked about afterward, the 7 seconds of wrongness before understanding arrived. The light shifted at the horizon first, a haze that the brain tried to classify as weather, as pollution, as something ordinary. It was not ordinary. It was the thermal bloom of mass driver kinetic strikes entering the upper atmosphere at angles that no meteorological event could produce. By the time the sound reached the city, the first impacts had already happened 60 kilometers away. Asha was 3 blocks from the water. The structural engineering conference she had been resisting attending was being held in a basement-level room of the institute, 40 minutes from her house. Her supervisor had called that morning to remind her. She had told him she would think about it. She thought about it, she went. The ceiling of the basement room held. 3 days later, she found the envelope in her coat pocket while looking for her institute identification card. She sat on the floor of an emergency relief station that had been a school gymnasium the week before, and she held the envelope in both hands and she did not open it. Around her, people were moving with the particular efficiency of catastrophe, carrying things, organizing things, trying to turn chaos into process because process was the only response humans had ever found for the unresponsive. She sat on the floor and she understood, with the part of her brain that had spent 15 years thinking about load-bearing failure, that she had just passed through her own failure point and come out the other side into something she did not have a name for yet. She had not found Rava, she had not found Daln. The gymnasium was full of people who had not found someone and all of them were moving, so she stood up and started moving too. She kept the envelope, she put it in her left breast pocket where she could feel it. The Thalvec Dominion had conquered 14 star systems before it reached Earth. In each of those systems, 11 of the 14 species that had attempted organized resistance had been suppressed within 18 months. The Thalvec knew this. They considered it a closed question. They had arrived at Earth with a garrison force they calculated as sufficient, established occupation zones, begun processing humans for labor extraction, and sent a report back to the Sovereign Absolute describing the 14th system as secured. They were not wrong about what they had done, they were wrong about what they had started. The Thalvec engines, Asha would discover later, had not been meaningfully updated in 3 centuries. They had stopped iterating because nothing had ever required them to. She held a captured drive component in her hands 8 months after the founding silence. That was what survivors had begun calling it. The day the sky burned, and she saw it immediately, the way you see a structural flaw when you know what to look for. The tolerances were old. The design was old. The Thalvec had built something that worked and then they had stopped, because the universe had never given them a reason to improve it. Humanity had never stopped improving anything. She set the component down on the work table and wrote 3 numbers in her notebook. The numbers represented the modifications she believed were possible. He showed them to Dr. Savin Riul, who had escaped the Kelvar research station by hiding in a coolant access shaft for 11 hours, and who now laughed at slightly wrong moments due to something that had rearranged itself in her stress-response architecture during those 11 hours. Dr. Riul looked at the numbers, laughed once short, startled, and then covered her mouth with her hand and said, "Sorry, that's just those numbers are actually insane. Sorry, I mean that as a compliment." Asha said, "Can you do it?" Dr. Riul looked at the numbers again. "Yes," she said, "it'll take 2 years. You have 18 months. It took 14. That was the version of time that the resistance operated in, the time things were supposed to take and the time they actually took, and the gap between them which was filled with people working through sleep deprivation and grief, and the specific focus that comes from having nothing left to protect except the thing you are building. Nerve station smelled like machine oil and recycled atmosphere. The walls were always slightly warm from the reactor banks. Asha had a bunk she rarely used and a workstation she rarely left, and every 3 weeks or so she would find her hand pressed flat against her left breast pocket in the middle of a briefing, not opening the envelope, just confirming it was still there. Warrant Officer Preth Callow had been 17 years old when the city burned. He was a signals technician with fast hands and a tendency to press his back against corridor walls when moving through unfamiliar spaces, a habit he had developed in the first weeks after the founding silence and never entirely lost. He was precise, formal, and slightly too steady in crisis situations in a way that Asha recognized as mimicry. He had watched her perform calm for long enough that he had learned to perform it himself. She was not sure whether to feel responsible for this. She had decided it was not the worst thing she had given someone. Engineer Commander Tav Osran had been a merchant fleet officer before the founding silence. He had lost no family because he had no family left before the burning, a circumstance he mentioned exactly once in passing without apparent need for response. He fought with a quiet efficiency that the rest of the crew initially read as coldness. It was not coldness. Asha had recognized it the first week. It was the particular economy of someone who has already done all their grief and come out the other side into pure function. He was the most reliable person on the station, and she trusted him the way you trust a structural element that has been tested past its rated tolerance and held. Dr. Savin Riul apologized for laughing at wrong moments approximately 400 times across the 7 years they worked together. By the third year, nobody needed the apology anymore. The laugh had become a kind of diagnostic. If Rule laughed, something had just exceeded expected parameters, and that was either very good or very bad, and the difference was visible in how quickly she covered her mouth. 7 years, 38 ships built in a hollowed asteroid and a seafloor facility and a crater installation on the far side of the moon where Thalvec sensors had a documented blind spot. The TRV unmarked grave was the flagship. Hull painted flat black, no external markings, interior walls engraved with names. Every human who had died on the first day. 2 billion names and characters 2 millimeters tall, covering every surface of every corridor. The crew walked among the dead every shift. They had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a smell when you live inside it long enough. Asha had not stopped noticing. She walked those corridors deliberately. She read names while she could not sleep, which was often. The fleet was 38 ships against an empire. She had run the numbers. She ran them again. The numbers said the same thing every time, and the thing they said was not "this is impossible." The thing they said was "this requires a specific kind of stupid that most species are not capable of sustaining." Humans, she had concluded, were specifically capable of it. Year 7, Day 1, she gave the order that started everything. Simultaneous, that was the only way it worked, not a strike but a removal. She had studied load-bearing failure for 15 years, and she applied the same principle to an empire: find the points where the weight concentrates and remove them all at once. The Thalvec occupation infrastructure across Earth had exactly 7 critical relay nodes. She hit all 7 in the same second. The garrison commander on the surface did not have time to reach a console. Tav Osren reported from navigation with the flatness of someone reading atmospheric data. All 7 targets confirmed destroyed. No distress signal transmitted. No distress signal. That had been the core requirement, not the destruction itself, the silence around it. The Thalvec Dominion, 400 years old and 14 systems wide, had received no word of trouble from its 14th acquisition. It would receive none. The only communication it would get from Earth was the one Asha recorded 6 hours later, standing in a pressed uniform in front of a viewport through which the blue-gray curve of Earth was visible, partially rebuilt in the 7 years since the burning, the light at the Terminator slightly different from how she remembered it. She had thought about what to say for a long time. She had decided not to say very much. "My name is Commander Asha Meridh of the Terran Reclamation Fleet," she said, her voice level and unhurried. 7 years ago, you made a calculation about my species. You calculated that grief is a weakness. I am transmitting to inform you that your data was incorrect." She paused. "We are coming." She ended the transmission without a threat. The absence of a threat was the threat. The Thalvec Dominion received a message from a dead species that had rebuilt itself in secret and wanted nothing from them except to be understood. The Sovereign Absolute watched it in his sealed observation chamber and asked his advisors what threat category to assign to a woman whose daughter had been dead for 6 years. His advisors did not have a category for what she was. 3 weeks later, 300 Thalvec warships assembled at the nearest transit point and accelerated toward Earth. Asha watched the approach data on the navigation display in Nerve Station's operations center, eating from a foil ration packet she was not tasting. The packet was labeled something citrus adjacent. She chewed and read the formation data and chewed again. Tav Osren was at the adjacent station, running trajectory calculations he had already run twice. He ran them a third time. Neither of them spoke. Dr. Ruel laughed once and covered her mouth. "The formation," she said, "they're flying the standard suppression grid. Textbook, it's textbook." "I know," Asha said. "They've never had to improvise." "I know," Asha set down the ration packet. "That's why it works." The Battle of Drevith Reach lasted 41 minutes. 300 Thalvec warships, 38 human vessels. On paper, those numbers described a situation with a predictable outcome. The Thalvec commanders had seen those numbers and agreed with the prediction. They had arranged their ships in the standard suppression grid, a formation designed across centuries of conquest to create overlapping fields of fire with no dead zones. It was an excellent formation. It worked correctly when the enemy formed up opposite it and engaged on expected vectors. The human ships did not form up. They moved as Asha had trained them to move, not as a fleet but as a structural analysis problem. Where does the formation bear weight? Where are the connective nodes? Remove those and the rest fails. Each human ship had a specific target sequence, calculated not by experienced military commanders but by engineers and physicists who had spent 7 years studying Thalvec formation doctrine, the way you study a building you intend to bring down. They moved fast. They moved without pattern. They absorbed losses: 9 ships, 412 people whose names Asha would add to the wall, and they did not stop. When the last Thalvec ship in Thalvec Reach went silent, the fleet transmitted their battle report to the Dominion command network. Or rather, the Thalvec admirals who had survived by fleeing early transmitted their own report. It described human tactics as non-doctrinal. They meant it as a criticism. It was a confession. It meant, we built a doctrine and you refuse to fight inside it, and we do not know what to do with an enemy that refuses to fight inside our doctrine. They had been winning wars for 400 years, and they had never once had to write that sentence. Asha read the intercepted report. She read it twice. Then she set a course for Velcorum. Velcorum was a labor world in the Thalvec interior. Its surface quarried to the mantle over 3 centuries of extraction. From orbit it looked like a wound, great gray-brown gouges in the crust where rock had been removed and never replaced, no vegetation, no standing water, settlements of prefabricated structures arranged at the quarry mouths like teeth around an open mouth. The Thalvec garrison had been there for 112 years. They were not there anymore. The garrison commander had received the Thalvec Reach report. He had looked at the numbers: 280 Thalvec ships destroyed, 9 human, enemy fleet still fully operational, and he had made a calculation. He had evacuated in 18 hours, taking equipment and records and leaving the Cathali labor population to whatever was coming. This was, by Thalvec historical record, the first time a Dominion garrison commander had retreated from an unconquered position. Asha brought the TRV unmarked grave into low orbit and authorized a landing team. She went down herself. The quarry settlements were quiet in a way that quarries are not supposed to be quiet. No machinery, no transport vehicles, just the distant drip of groundwater in the shafts and the sound of several thousand people who were not sure yet whether they were allowed to move. The Cathali were small, slight-framed, with large secondary eyelids that closed horizontally when the light changed too fast. Their fingers were long and precisely articulated, adapted across generations for fine mechanical work. They had been kept here for a century, and they were, Asha saw immediately, in the particular physical condition of people who have been given enough food to work and not enough food to thrive. Their movements were careful in the way that people become careful when they have learned that excess movement costs calories they cannot replace. An elder met her at the quarry entrance. Preth Callow translated in fragments, the Cathali's clicking tonal language arriving in his earpiece and emerging from his mouth in English with slight delays, like light from something far away. The elder's name was Sethrin. She had worked the same tunnel face for 40 years. She looked at Asha for a long moment. Then, through Preth Callow's slightly delayed translation, she said, "We heard you had nothing left. We thought that meant you had stopped. We did not understand that nothing left and nothing to lose are different things." Asha stood in the gray light of Velcorum's quarry entrance and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have words for. She thought about the gymnasium floor. She thought about the envelope. "The Thalvec are gone," she said. "They won't come back." Sethrin studied her. "Why?" she asked. "You could have passed us by." Asha was quiet for a moment. Around her, the Cathali settlement was beginning slowly to move, people emerging from structured doorways, watching from a cautious distance. "Because someone should have come for us," she said. "When the Thalvec arrived at Earth, nobody came. No species in the galaxy intervened. We were alone." She looked at the people gathering at the quarry mouth. "I won't let another species feel that alone." Preth Callow translated. Sethrin was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that Preth Callow translated as, "The Thalvec told us all species are selfish, that everyone fights only for themselves." "They were wrong about a lot of things," Asha said. Word traveled faster than the fleet. Within 3 weeks of Velcorum, the Cathali engineers who had serviced Thalvec relay infrastructure across 4 systems began, systematically and without coordination from Asha's command, taking that infrastructure apart. Not destroying it. Disassembling it with the precision of people who had spent a century learning every tolerance and join point of every Thalvec system, and repurposing the components for uses the Thalvec had not designed them for. The relay network that had kept the Dominion's 14 systems in communication developed gaps. The gaps became silences. The silences became strategic. 3 Ovran garrison battalions on different worlds mutinied in the same week, turning on their Thalvec commanders with the particular fury of soldiers who had spent decades fighting for a cause they had been given no choice about. Their bioluminescent spinal markings, which shifted color with emotional state, burned a deep red through the engagements, a color that Thalvec biology associated with warning and that Ovran culture associated with resolution. Ships arrived. Species that had been enslaved for generations had, it turned out, been watching the Thalvec Reach battle data on intercepted frequencies, running their own calculations, reaching their own conclusions. 290 ships, 12 species. A coalition built not on alliance but on a shared comprehension of what the Dominion had cost them. They called themselves nothing formally. The Thalvec intelligence reports called them the Liberation Fleet, and it stuck. The fleet grew, the Dominion contracted. And the weight of command, which Asha had been carrying since the gymnasium floor, accumulated in ways she had stopped measuring because measuring it did not change it. She stopped sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch somewhere around month 5 of the campaign. She was aware of this. She was also aware that there was not a version of the next 2 months that allowed for more, so she worked with what she had. At 3:17 on a Thursday, the ship ran on a standardized clock that bore no relationship to any planet's rotation, but the crew kept the week anyway because humans apparently needed weeks. Tav Osran found her in the engraving corridor on Deck 7. She was standing in front of a section of wall near the engineering bay junction. The names here were from a coastal district 3 blocks from the water. She had been reading them for 20 minutes. Osran sat down on the deck beside her without asking. He looked at the wall. He did not offer comfort. He did not say anything at all for a long time. Then, in the quiet voice he used for statements that were not operational, he said, "I keep looking for my own name. I know it won't be there. I look anyway." Asha turned to look at him. In 7 years, she had never heard him say anything personal. He was looking at the wall, not at her. "Nobody put your name up," she said. "No, I was already gone before they came." He was quiet. "Merchant run. I came back to a system that wasn't there anymore, no one to look for, so there's no name to find." A pause. "I don't know what I'm looking for when I look." She did not answer. There was not an answer. She sat down on the deck beside him and they read names in silence for another 20 minutes, and in the morning she gave the daily briefing with her voice completely level, and the crew noticed that she seemed slightly less assembled than the day before and considerably more dangerous, and nobody said anything about either observation. The fleet assembled at the edge of Thalvec sovereign space 6 weeks later. 900 Thalvec warships in a defensive sphere around their home world. Amber-colored oceans visible from the approach corridor, bone-white cities on 3 continents, 9 billion people who had been born into an empire and lived their lives at its center and had, most of them, never given a single conquest order. A population, a civilization, a world. Asha opened a fleet-wide channel. She did not give a speech. She had never given speeches. She said, "Everyone here has already paid the price. What we do now is decide what we bought with it." She closed the channel. On Preth Kalo's sensor panel, a new alarm tone began, a sound she had not heard before, low and continuous, pulling data from captured Thalvec census records. A number appeared in cold white light. 9 billion. She did not understand yet what the alarm was telling her. She would understand in approximately 40 minutes. The fleet advanced. The quarry on Velcorum had no sunrise. The planet's rotation was slow enough that dawn arrived as a gradual brightening rather than a line of light, the gray sky becoming slightly less gray over the course of an hour until something that qualified as morning established itself without announcement. Asha had been awake for it. She had been awake for most of the night since Drevith Reach, which was not unusual, but this particular sleeplessness had a different texture. Not the operational kind, the kind that runs on caffeine and task lists and the knowledge that stopping means something doesn't get done. This was the kind that comes after a conversation you were not expecting to have, that keeps replaying not because it was painful but because it rearranged something. Nothing left and nothing to lose are different things. She stood at the quarry entrance in the early gray light and watched the Cathali settlement come awake. It did not come awake the way she was used to, not the rush of shipboard morning shift change, not the controlled urgency of Nerv Station starting another 16-hour cycle. It came awake slowly, carefully, people emerging from prefabricated doorways and standing in the open air with the specific stillness of individuals who have learned not to move quickly because quick movement attracts attention. They stood and breathed and looked at the sky, and some of them, she noticed, were looking at a sky without Thalvec patrol craft in it for the first time in their lives. Preth Kalo appeared at her shoulder. "Sethrin is asking if we need the settlement to clear the landing zone." "No," Asha said. "Tell her we don't need anything from them. Tell her we're the ones who owe a debt here." He transmitted a pause. He said, "She says humans are strange." She's not wrong. The Cathali engineers began within 72 hours. Asha did not ask them to. Nobody coordinated it. Sethrin had apparently spoken to people who had spoken to people across 4 systems through channels the Thalvec had never thought to monitor, because the Thalvec had never considered that their enslaved labor populations might be communicating in the clicking tonal language that no Thalvec administrator had ever bothered to learn. The relay infrastructure that kept the Dominion's nervous system connected began developing gaps. Then the silences began to compound. Dr. Ruel pulled the network data 3 weeks after Velcorum and laughed so sharply that Tav Osran looked up from his station. "Sorry," she said immediately, hand at her mouth. "Sorry, it's just they've taken down 11 relay nodes in 4 systems and the Thalvec command network is routing around it. But the routing is taking longer each time and they're going to hit a cascade threshold in." She ran the calculation, approximately 19 days. Can they fix it? Asha asked. Not without the engineers who are doing this to them. Ryul covered a second laugh. Sorry. Tav Osran looked back at his station. Efficient, he said. It was not quite a compliment. It was something more than one. The Ovran mutinies happened the same week. 3 garrison battalions on 3 separate worlds, no apparent coordination, the same result. Thalvec commanders relieved of command by the soldiers who had been executing their orders for decades. The Ovran's bioluminescent spinal markings burned steady red through the engagements, the color their culture associated with a decision that has been made and will not be revisited. Asha watched the intercepted footage and thought about the 11 species that Sethran had named, the ones that had tried in the first decade and been suppressed in 18 months. The difference, she thought, was not the humans. The difference was that this time, the 11 species did not have to try alone. Ships arrived from 6 systems in the same month. Some were warships, some were repurposed mining haulers with weapon systems that Dr. Ryul described as creative and technically functional and then laughed at and apologized for laughing at. 12 species, 290 vessels, a fleet built not on treaty or alliance but on a shared accounting of what had been taken and a shared decision about what should happen next. The TRV unmarked grave, still black and unmarked on the outside, moved through a fleet of ships that bore the markings of a dozen civilizations that had been told for generations they were conquered, finished, absorbed. They were none of those things. They called themselves the Liberation Fleet because the Thalvec intelligence reports had called them that first, and it seemed accurate enough to keep. The weight of it accumulated the way structural load accumulates in a building, not suddenly, but incrementally, each addition with intolerances, until one day you run the numbers and realize the total has exceeded what the frame was rated for. Asha ran the numbers on herself occasionally. She always came up short on sleep, short on calories, short on the specific kind of stillness that humans require to stay functional at the level she was requiring herself to stay functional. She compensated by knowing exactly which tolerances she was violating and monitoring the effects. She was monitoring the effects at 3:17 on a Thursday when Tav Osran sat down on the deck beside her in the engraving corridor on Deck 7. He said after a long silence, I keep looking for my own name. I know it won't be there, I look anyway. She had thought about that sentence every day since he said it. She thought about it now, watching the fleet's final approach data scroll across the navigation display in the operations center 6 weeks later. He had been gone before they came. Nobody had put his name on the wall because nobody had known he survived, and by the time they would have known, the wall was already a fixed record, and adding a living person to a wall of the dead was not something anyone had figured out how to do. So he looked for a name that wasn't there, and he kept looking. She understood this. She understood it in a way she had not understood it when he said it, which meant she had still been learning something. 6 weeks out from the final engagement, 7 years into a war she had built from a gymnasium floor. The possibility that she was still learning things felt important, though she could not have explained why. Preth Kalo's voice came over the command channel. Commander, fleet formation complete. We are holding at the perimeter. Hold, she said. 900 Thalvec warships in a defensive sphere around their home world. The formation was recognizable, the standard command grid, the overlapping fire coverage, the same doctrine that had worked for 400 years. It had not worked at Drevith Reach because she had refused to engage it on its own terms. It would not work here for the same reason. She looked at the sensor data, amber-colored oceans, bone-white cities, 9 billion people, most of whom had spent their entire lives at the center of an empire whose edges they had never seen. She opened the fleet-wide channel. Everyone here has already paid the price, she said. What we do now is decide what we bought with it. She closed the channel. On Preth Kalo's panel, the census alarm continued its low tone. The fleet advanced. The battle lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than Drevith Reach and shorter than any engagement of equivalent scale in Thalvec military history. The Thalvec commanders were not incompetent. They were constrained by doctrine, by a command structure that required authorization before deviation, by 4 centuries of warfare against enemies who fought inside predictable parameters. The Liberation Fleet did not fight inside predictable parameters. Cathali engineers had spent the preceding weeks introducing specific faults into the relay systems that the Thalvec fleet depended on for formation coordination. The faults activated at the 40-minute mark of the engagement. For 11 seconds, the Thalvec command network went silent. 11 seconds. Tav Osran later said that 11 seconds was approximately 10 seconds longer than they needed. Ships fell, on both sides, 22 Liberation Fleet vessels destroyed, 140 Thalvec in the first 40 minutes alone. Asha watched the casualty data and did not look away from it, because the names on the wall had taught her that looking away was a kind of lie you told yourself about the cost of decisions, and she had decided a long time ago to be honest about costs. The Thalvec lines broke at the 2-hour mark. Not a coordinated retreat, a fracture individual commanders making individual calculations. The formation losing coherence the way a load-bearing structure loses coherence when enough nodes fail simultaneously. Ships fled. Others attempted to surrender via emergency frequency. The Liberation Fleet processed surrender signals and held fire because Asha had given that order at the beginning and meant it. At 3 hours and 20 minutes, the sensor panel in front of Preth Kallo changed. The census alarm that had been running since the final approach went quiet. A different alarm replaced it, not a tone, but a sustained signal pulling data from deep-scan geological sensors that the fleet had been passively running since entering the system. The data showed an energy buildup beneath the capital city's foundation level, not a weapon pointed outward. A weapon pointed downward. Tav Osran checked the reading. He checked it again. He looked up. Tectonic destabilizers, he said. Subsurface array. The energy signature matches Thalvec archival weapon classifications from the Consolidation Wars. A pause. It's aimed at their own planet. The number on the panel changed. 9 billion. Now she understood what the alarm had been telling her. The bridge of the TRV unmarked grave was quiet. Not the operational quiet of a ship between engagements. The deeper quiet of a space where everyone present understands that something is being decided and that speaking might accidentally become the deciding. 12 officers, 1 commander, the sustained alarm tone, low and continuous, and the number in cold white light. Tav Osran was at the navigation station, checking a reading he had already verified. He checked it again. He did not look at Asha. She touched her left breast pocket. The envelope was there. It was always there. The paper had softened at the edges from years of handling, the creases set permanently into geography she knew by feel. She had not opened it, not once. She had carried it through the gymnasium floor and Nerve Station and Drevith Reach and Vel Coram and the engraving corridor at 300 and now here. The bridge of a flagship at the end of a 7-year war, with a number on a panel and 40 minutes on a clock. Preth Kallo's voice was completely steady. "Commander, your orders." He had learned that from her. The steadiness that was not the absence of fear but the decision to work inside it because the work did not stop for fear, because the work was the only thing that moved you forward when everything else had been taken. She thought about Vel Coram. She thought about Sethran's horizontal eyelids closing slowly in the gray light of a quarry entrance, and the way she had said nothing left and nothing to lose are different things, and the way Asha had felt something shift in her chest that she did not have words for. She thought about what the difference was. She had been thinking about it for 6 weeks. Nothing left meant there was no future to protect. Nothing to lose meant you had already decided what the past was for. 9 billion people on a planet had not voted for the Consolidation Wars. They had not voted for the slave camps on Vel Coram or the 14 systems, or the garrison at Earth, or the mass driver strikes, or any mourning that any family had lost to the Thalvec Dominion's administrative decision that their world was available. They had been born into the center of an empire the way anyone is born into anything, without choosing it, without endorsing it, into the specific life that was waiting when they arrived. She thought about Rava, not the grief of her, the specific fact of her, 8 years old, the toast experiment, the notebook where she wrote down results. The question about marigolds that Asha had not answered because she assumed she would have another chance to answer it. What would Rava have become if she had had the time to become something? Not a soldier, something quieter, something that built. The 40-minute clock showed 38 minutes. Asha took her hand away from her pocket. "Target the destabilizer array," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were not. She looked at them briefly, noted the shaking, and decided it was honest. "Everything we have, right now." Preth Kallo did not pause. He relayed the order to the fleet with the efficiency of someone who had spent 7 years learning to trust her judgment even when, especially when, he did not yet understand it. The Liberation Fleet responded. 290 ships redirected weapon systems to a single point beneath 3 kilometers of Thalvec granite. The array was defended. Of course it was defended. The Sovereign Absolute had not activated his final order without protecting it. 11 Thalvec warships that had not yet surrendered moved to intercept. The Liberation Fleet engaged them. Not because engaging them was efficient, but because it was necessary, and necessity and efficiency had only sometimes been the same thing across 7 years of this war. The sustained signal fired for 11 minutes. The destabilizer array's power signature peaked, wavered, peaked again. Then it went silent. 29 minutes remaining on the clock. Asha sat back in her command chair. Her hands were still shaking. She did not put them in her lap. She set them flat on the armrests and looked at the planet on the main display, amber oceans and bone-white cities, intact 9 billion people alive in it who did not know yet how close the number had come to being 0. "Is that it?" Tav Osran said from navigation. "That's it," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had led to it, all the weight of all the decisions, sitting in the room with them now that there was finally enough quiet to hear it. 3 hours later, a Thalvec civilian emergency channel broadcast a single message. The people of the capital city had entered the Sovereign Absolute's bunker. They had found Krivith Moore in his sealed observation chamber, 400 years old, still waiting for reports that would not come. They had taken him into custody. They were offering him to the Liberation Fleet. Prethkalo relayed the message. He waited. "Tell them we accept," Asha said. "Tell them we'll send a transport." Another pause. "They're asking if you'll come yourself to receive him." She thought about it for 3 seconds. "No," she said, "he's not the point." Prethkalo transmitted the response. Then, quietly, "They're also asking to speak with you, the Civilian Council. They say they have something they want to tell you." Asha looked at the planet, 9 billion people who had not voted for any of this. "Tell them not yet," she said. "Tell them I'll come when I'm ready." She did not know when she would be ready. She thought maybe that was acceptable. The dissolution of the Thalvec Dominion took 3 months, which was faster than anyone who had spent 7 years fighting it expected and slower than anyone who needed it to be over could quite tolerate. Asha delegated. She was good at delegation now, and the way you become good at things you do constantly under pressure. She attended 2 treaty sessions, signed what needed signing, answered what needed answering, left before the commemorations began. She was offered the governance of Earth. She declined. She was offered command of the new coalition compact. She declined. "I'm a structural engineer who learned to fight," she told the Earth Council representative, a young man who had clearly prepared a speech about legacy and responsibility. "That's what this moment needed." "It's not what the next moment needs. Find someone who builds things that last." The young man looked at her for a moment and then nodded, the nod of someone who had expected resistance and received something more specific, which was harder to argue with. Sathran came to Nerv Station 2 weeks before it was decommissioned. She came with a delegation of 12 Cathali engineers, which was apparently the culturally appropriate number for a significant formal visit, though Prethkalo confessed he had not been able to confirm this from the translation documentation and might be wrong. Sathran looked the same as she had in the quarry entrance on Velcorum, small, precise horizontal eyelids closing slowly when the station's recycled light shifted in the morning cycle. She carried something wrapped in a piece of cloth. She handed it to Asha without ceremony. Inside the cloth was a piece of mineral from the quarry face. Gray-brown, heavy for its size, one surface smooth from decades of contact with equipment and hands. The same tunnel face Sathran had worked for 40 years. "Not a symbol," Sathran said through Prethkalo's translation. A pause, "just a piece of the place, for someone who gave us something back." Asha held the mineral in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She thought about Tav Osran in the engraving corridor looking for a name that wasn't there. She thought about what you carry when there is no name to find and what it means when someone hands you a piece of a place instead. "Thank you," she said. Sathran's secondary eyelids closed once, slowly. Then she turned and spoke to her delegation in clicking tonal language, and they began the business of the visit, which involved inspecting Nerv Station's engineering systems with the focused attention of professionals who cannot help but assess load tolerances wherever they go. Prethkalo found Asha on the last day before departure, standing in the decommissioned operations center where the fleet had been planned and built and launched. The screens were dark. The workstations were cleared. The walls were still warm from the reactor banks that were being wound down. He stood beside her and looked at the dark screens. "Do you regret it?" he asked, "saving the sovereign world?" She looked at him. He was standing with his back away from the wall. She noticed this the way you notice a thing you have been watching for a long time and have finally seen change. "I regret everything that made it necessary," she said, "not the thing itself." He nodded. He seemed to understand the distinction. He had always been good at understanding distinctions, even the ones that were difficult to articulate, which was perhaps why she had trusted him for 7 years with the things that needed to be said precisely. "What will you do?" he asked. "Go home," she said. "Is there a home to go to?" She thought about this. "There's a place," she said. "That's enough to start with." Earth had been rebuilding for 7 years. It was not the same. It would not be the same. The coastal district 3 blocks from the water had different buildings now, shorter and wider, built with the specific pragmatism of reconstruction rather than the optimism of original construction. The streets had been relaid at slightly different angles where the original foundations had not survived. The park that had been a park was still a park, expanded, its new plantings still young enough to look intentional rather than natural. At its center was the memorial. Names in stone. Millions of them, carved in the same 2mm characters that covered the walls of the TRV unmarked grave, which was now in a museum orbit and would stay there, because the crew had voted unanimously that it should not be decommissioned, and Asha had agreed, and the coalition compact had agreed, and that had been the end of the discussion. The memorial had a fountain at its center that ran continuously. The sound of it was audible from the garden path. She found the section for her family without difficulty. She had memorized the coordinates from the planning documents when the memorial was being designed, which she had read from a distance of several star systems, which had been the only way she could manage reading them. Rivameri Don Mary. The names were carved the same size as every other name in every other section. They were not larger or marked differently or given any particular prominence. She had asked for this specifically. They were 2 names among millions, which was what they were, which was the truth of it. She stood in front of the stone for a while. The afternoon sun had warmed it. The fountain ran. Somewhere behind her, a bird she did not recognize made a sound she did not recognize, which meant it was something new, something the reconstruction had brought back or introduced, which meant the world was still changing, still adding things. She reached into her left breast pocket. The envelope had been there so long that its shape had become part of the pocket's shape, a permanent absence-made presence, the thing the pocket was built around without being built for it. She took it out. The paper was soft at the edges, the creases set so deep they would not unfold fully even if she tried. The orange of the marigold was still visible through the paper, faint but present, the color holding after 7 years the way some things hold. She did not open it. She pressed it flat against the stone where Rivaz's name was carved, and she held it there with both palms, and she felt the stone's warmth come through the paper and into her hands, and she stayed that way for a long time. Then she took her hands away. The envelope stayed. Pressed against the stone, held by nothing except the slight texture of the surface and its own softened weight. She stepped back. The fountain ran. The stone held the warmth of the afternoon. The marigold's color showed through the paper, still orange, still faintly itself, against 2 names carved the same size as every other name in a memorial that held millions, on a planet that was not the same and was still alive, in a garden where something new was making a sound she had not heard before.